In this video, we're going to discuss dot notation and how it can be used to fix a common AngularJS scope hierarchy problem. In AngularJS, it is important to understand scope hierarchy and the relationship between parent scopes and child scopes. All child scopes inherit from their parents via prototypical inheritance. Therefore, any properties or methods created on a parent are automatically available to its ancestors. This usually works fine. However, you must be careful when using primitives on a scope, because Angular may create new scope variables on the fly that will hide or shadow parent variables. This common problem confuses many new Angular developers. Often the developer is expecting to bind to a parent scope variable, but two-way data binding creates a child variable of the same name. In this case, instead of binding to the parent, Angular will bind to the child and cause unexpected results. Fortunately, we can get around this behavior by always storing our scope variables in an object rather than creating a primitive. This in effect forces Angular to use the parent scope variable and stops the shadowing effect. So we're going to see this in action. If you look at my HTML code, I have a parent controller that I've created in a div and a child controller that's nested inside the parent. In my app.js, I have defined my parent controller and my child controller. And now I'm going to put some code into the index file so I can see bind to a variable, a primitive, in my app.js. I'm going to create a variable called name once I've pasted my parent binding and my child binding. Now in the parent controller, I'm going to create a new variable, and I'm going to call the name John Smith. Now when I run this, as you can see, the primitive John, or the primitive name, is bound both in the parent controller and the child controller, as we would expect. The problem arises when we create an input box which implements a two-way data binding using ngModel. So as you can see, I've put two inputs in the HTML. The first one is in the parent and the second one is in the child. Now when I run this, an interesting thing occurs. If I change the value of the parent input box, both the parent and child work properly, as you would expect. But if I go down to the child and I make a change, that in effect breaks the data binding from the parent. And the reason is because this second input box that is in the child, once I make a change to the value, it's actually looking on the child scope and seeing that the value that is two-way data bound doesn't exist on it and creating a new one and therefore shadowing the parent. Now obviously we don't want this sort of thing to occur, so how do we get around it? Well, the easiest way to get around it is to always use dot notation between your controllers and your views. And in order to do that, we just introduce an object that stores our values rather than primitives. So in this case, I'm going to name an object called model, which is kind of the way I like to name all of the elements that I'm going to bind to my view. And in it, I'm going to define a property called name. And rather than bind directly to the scope.name, I'm going to bind to scope.model.name. And that will solve the problem. So now when I come down to my view, I'm just going to prefix name with model.name. And when I run this, now it should work as expected, where I can change the parent value with the input box, and I can also change the child value. And so that is an example of using dot notation to deal with scope hierarchy in AngularJS.